Hey all, here OS Reviews. Over the past 2 years, there's been a resurgence in the popularity of Digicams or point-and-shoot digital cameras, largely attributed to the nostalgic vibes that these older Digicams can produce. Yes, our modern-day smartphones can produce objectively more perfect-looking photos through software processing and computational photography, but sometimes the imperfections in a photo, a more raw, organic look, might actually be more artistic to some. So there's been modern interpretations like the Cam Snap, not to mention hundreds of other generic cameras that pop up if you're searching on Amazon, for example. But unfortunately, the quality of those photos are actually not very good. In fact, some would describe it as a scamera because the specs are often inflated. For instance, some of them say 48 or 64 megapixels, but it's actually having just something like a 2 megapixel sensor and then interpolating it, blowing it up into something like 48 or 64 megapixels, resulting in rather poor performance. The majority of these are using digital zoom, so you aren't able to have optical zoom. It's not going to look very sharp. And so that got me thinking, why don't we actually revisit a real Digicam from the 2000s that many of these are modeled after, bring some awareness to a higher quality model that might be worth considering instead. Which is why the subject of this video is going to be the Panasonic Lumix LX3, as well as briefly touching on the Lumix LX2, its predecessor that came before it. And the LX series are Panasonic's more ambitious, enthusiast-grade Digicams, including the original LX1 came out back in 2005, and it was the smallest digital camera at the time that could capture in RAW, allowing you to more easily edit the photos using software like Photoshop, for example, preserving more details, and also being unique for having a native 16:9 wide aspect ratio sensor. That is compared to the majority of other digital cameras actually having a more squarish, maybe 3:2 or 4:3 aspect ratio. And then if you wanted to achieve a 16:9 frame, camera is basically cropping off the top and bottom sections of the sensor. And aside from the unique sensor aspect ratio plus the ability to shoot in RAW, the LX line are usually incorporating a rather sharp Leica lens. In fact, Leica were so impressed by the performance of the LX series that they actually worked with Panasonic and rebranded a version, calling it the Leica Deluxe3 as well as the Deluxe4 are basically equivalents of Panasonic's LX2 and LX3 that we have in front of us, offering nearly identical performance because the components inside are all the same. So it might be a bit of a licensing or branding play, but it also goes to show the quality of these cameras. They were very confident in its performance despite the small form factor. That being said, I would say that the LX3, again, the main focus of this video, is really when the LX series started to find its stride. Even though the dimensions here are a little bit larger, it offered some notable improvements. For instance, it introduced a hot shoe on the very top that was missing on the original LX1 and LX2, meaning that you could attach adapters like external flash, optical viewfinders, which are missing by default on these smaller point-and-shoot cameras, granting it more modular accessories. And in a similar sense, the front lens ring can actually be removed like we have here on the LX3, and you can actually screw in adapters that can act as a lens hood or shade if you're shooting in really bright conditions, and this was a functionality missing on the original LX1 and 2 that did not support the ability for you to snap on any accessories on the lens. Furthermore, Panasonic also sold a wide-angle lens converter accessory that you can pop on if you wanted an even larger field of view when capturing shots. Again, improving on the versatility of the system, not to mention the lens also saw an improvement for the aperture. So it now started at a pretty bright and sharp f2.0 and impressively only reduces down to f2.8 even when you are zooming all the way in. Compared to on the LX1 and LX2, it started at a slightly less bright f2.8 and then narrowed down to f4.9 when you are zoomed in. It's a little bit more conventional versus most other Digicams. A brighter aperture, such as the f2 here, allows you to just let in more light, helping it in situations that might not be always sunny. You don't have to increase the exposure time to get a great result. It can still snap images relatively quickly and also allows for slightly better depth of field. If you're looking at some of that natural separation of the foreground and the background, background known as bokeh that's usually a conjunction of a brighter lens in addition to a larger sensor size. And so the improved lens performance coupled with all of the added new modular components is why I think the LX3 onwards is where the series really found its stride. That being said, I do also really appreciate the simplicity, and I personally think that the design of the LX1 and LX2 might be even more iconic in a way, simply because from a design perspective, I just find it to be very forward-thinking. It's almost minimalist style from just a aesthetic point of view. In fact, if this is a camera that came out now, it would still look rather modern and sleek, versus a more traditional appearance of the LX3, LX5, and LX7 that came afterwards, plus the even smaller dimensions. So these certainly do have their merit, even though the specs are technically not as impressive, and also the processing speed when you're capturing images is also going to be just a little slower compared to the newer revisions. And speaking of the sensor inside, it measures 1/1.63 inches, so it's going to be actually a little bit larger compared to most other regular point-and-shoot cameras. For example, around the same time in 2008, Panasonic came out with their TZ5, and this was a more consumer-oriented camera that perhaps was also a little bit more popular just because it had a greater reach for the optical zoom, 10 times magnification, compared to on the LX3, it can only magnify around 2.5 times optically, so it just doesn't get you quite as far, not to mention a pretty significant difference in price. The TZ line usually sold for under $300 compared to the LX line actually sold for around $500 instead at the time. But these days, if you're searching for an LX3 on a used site like eBay and you're patient, you can often find deals that are under $100 when shopping around. Actually not too far off, in fact, compared to some of the retro-style Digicams like the Camp Snap, which are around $60 to $70 as well. You're actually not talking about a huge difference compared to one of these real vintage models as a true premium digital camera. Now, some other differences compared to the TZ, which stands for Travel Zoom series, is the lens also isn't as impressive. Yes, it's still branded as a Leica, but the aperture is going to be much slower, letting in less light. Even when you're not zooming in, it starts at f3.3, ending in f4.9, compared to, again, the f2.0 that this one starts at. So definitely a brighter and faster lens here, as well as a larger sensor compared to the 1/2.3 inch size that most of these cameras had. Granted, by 2025 standards, we often consider 1-inch type sensors as more of a larger sensor in enthusiast cameras like the Sony RX100 series, but the RX100 line is a very modern camera in my opinion. It also produces objectively better results. However, if you're going after more of this vintage year 2K aesthetic and vibe, then that's where the earlier LX cameras might be a better comparison point, and also more affordable than the RX100 series that are packing more modern components inside. For instance, these are using a CCD sensor instead of the CMOS sensors found on newer cameras like the RX100, and although it might be a bit of a generalization to say that the older CCD sensor technology produces more vintage-looking colors, I have to say that the color science and tuning back in the day definitely was a little different compared to modern cameras being more clinical, more neutral, and perhaps accurate, but perhaps not quite as nostalgic feeling. That being said, not all CCD cameras are made equal, but thankfully the combination of the components, including the lens, as well as the color tuning that Panasonic did, actually makes the LX series some of the better performing CCD sensor digital cameras that you can find. It actually is a rare instance where I do see some of the CCD magic in the photos that the LX3 can produce. The build quality of the LX series has always been top-notch, especially some of these earlier models were all made in Japan, constructed out of a solid piece of metal. It actually feels very reassuring in the hands. Definitely not cheap feeling compared to the Camp Snap. That's more like a toy. It's hollow, it's completely plastic, versus the premium metal build here. The grip is also relatively comfortable and easy to hold, and located on the very top, we still have access to, again, some of those interesting features that the original LX1 introduced, such as the ability to easily swap between aspect ratios when you're shooting, including the wider 16:9, or you can choose a 3:2 or a 4:3, adjusting for this on the fly instead of having to edit it in post. Located on the left here was another dial that you could use to change between autofocus versus a manual focus, and also a macro autofocus mode. Macro capabilities were another highlight of the LX series. It can get as close as 1 centimeter away from an object. It can almost touch the lens right on top, and the images can still be in focus and sharp. which is one advantage of the smaller sensor digital camera, so excellent macro capabilities. On the very top here, you also found access to a pop-up xenon flash, very bright, satisfying to push this up and down, and there's also going to be a mode selection dial, allowing you to go between options like the intelligent auto mode, as well as functions like the program priority, aperture priority, shutter priority, depending on if you're capturing action shots versus want to let in more light, as well as a full manual mode can also be found. Now, one option that isn't built into the earlier LX cameras though would be a custom dial that can be used to rotate focus, for example, on the lens. There is still manual focus, but you have to instead use the D-pad on the back, which is a little bit more clunky, and it's something that they added in later revisions, adding in a command dial. There's also two custom preset options. For example, you can save certain recipes, such as increasing, decreasing the exposure, or even applying certain filters. In fact, there is a dynamic black and white monochrome mode, and you can assign some of those shortcuts into the custom modes to commonly reference on the fly. There's also going to be a video mode, although to be honest, this is probably the mode that you'll use the least, with the resolution capped at 720p HD. Actually a little bit better than I expected, but still, it's likely that you'll get better performing video out of a modern smartphone, often getting at least full HD if not 4K in most instances. This is primarily used for taking still photos, where the, again, sharp lens, the excellent ergonomics in the grip, the physicality of the controls can still have an advantage, not to mention the fun color science that's just a little different from modern phones that still makes it a worthwhile option to consider if you're trying to pick up a retro digicam like this. Anyways, you also find the zoom rocker here. All of the buttons, by the way, are also crafted out of metal, just like the body or shell, so it does feel very premium and satisfying to use. Physical power key here, and then located on the back, you can also find some additional divots here to help with the grip, going between shooting versus preview options, as well as a conventional 4-way D-pad with an OK button that can also quickly launch to settings like flash, exposure. The screen on the back here, by the way, measures 3 inches diagonally, a little bit larger compared to past revisions of the LX line, and generally works fine. It's not going to be as sharp or the most beautiful screen by 2025 standards, but it does the job. Again, there is no built-in viewfinder, but because it supports a hot shoe on the top, you can also snap in accessories or even just a tunnel viewfinder if you wanted to do so. On the very back, there's also a metal tripod thread, as well as underneath here, the standard battery as well as SD card compartment slots. Last but not least, you can also find a USB connection slot as well as a display output slot on the side as well. And one other detail that sets it apart from the LX1 and 2, as well as other maybe more cost-effective digicams, is you can tell there are 2 straps on the left and right sides, so it can be hung more easily on your neck, for example, if you're walking around shooting images versus having only one on some of the less expensive point-and-shoot cameras. So anyways, turning on the camera, you can tell that the startup times are acceptable. I wouldn't say it's going to be lightning fast, but certainly gets the job done. Now, if we look a little closer on the lens here, there are a couple of details to keep in mind. One of them is there is no kind of leaf blade that covers it up like on, again, some of the more inexpensive travel zoom series cameras, which has this curtain designed to protect the lens. Instead, on the LX series, I think they're going after more of this retro or vintage style, even back in 2005 and 2008. So you had to use a kind of lens protector piece to snap on to prevent any dust from entering when not in use. It gets the job done, although you have to remember to remove it and then pop it back on again, because if you accidentally turn it on when the lens cover is in place, it will just fly off. Now, one other thing you might be wondering is how is it possible on the TZ series they're able to squeeze in a lens with so much more optical zoom reach into pretty similar dimensions as one that only has 2.5 times optical zoom? Well, the answer to that lies in the larger sensor size coupled with the faster aperture of the lens. So if they wanted to retain the f2.0, as well as keeping in mind that on the inside, the sensor for collecting light information is going to be a larger surface area versus the smaller one on the TZ series. So if they wanted to retain the same 10 times zoom, they would need larger optics and glass to cover up that larger surface area, and it would likely result in a larger camera with a more noticeable hump for the lens. So in order to make it more compact and still relatively slim, that's why on these enthusiast grade cameras you often see less reach or zoom capability compared to some of the more affordable travel zoom or bridge style cameras. Otherwise, Panasonic's UI is relatively clean and easy to understand. We can see how changing the aspect ratio will adjust the kind of picture here as we slide back and forth between the three dials up top. One thing to mention though is the actual sensor's aspect ratio on the LX3 reverts back to a slightly more conventional 4:3. So as it's converting into 16:9, it's still doing a little bit of cropping compared to the LX1 and LX2 that had the true 16:9 native aspect ratio for the sensor. So that is one minor change that I kind of wish they would have kept, to be honest, from the original LX1 and LX2, just because I thought it was a little bit more unique. You can also see that on the intelligent auto mode, it tries to recognize scenes by itself. Now in 2025, companies would call this AI, but scene recognition technology was built into digital cameras from 10-20 years ago. So this part is really nothing new and just goes to show the power of branding and marketing. But anyways, again, you're able to zoom in and out. Of course, it's going to be a little slower compared to modern day cameras for the lens there to retract. So you have to be a bit more patient as you're shooting and kind of slow down your pacing. And the same goes with the autofocus. As you can tell, there's only around 9 autofocus points on the sensor using contrast detect, so not as advanced as modern autofocus technology that's going to be lightning fast to lock in. All of this means you have to be a little bit more patient as you're capturing images with this camera, but it also goes with the whole kind of vintage Digicam vibe. In other words, as long as you don't expect it to be lightning fast, it can still be perfectly serviceable, and again, overall still a joy to use as the camera locks in and still produces very satisfying looking results. But for certain scenarios, if you're capturing action shots 24/7, then a model like this might still have its constraints. So anyways, if we go into some of the scene selection modes, you're also able to manually change into functions like portrait mode, soft skin, or kind of a beauty mode, very early version of that, changing some of the ISO and again scene properties, as well as even a children mode, a sunset mode that will boost the colors like orange, for example, beach mode, firework mode, snow mode, aerial photo, as well as the aforementioned film grain mode that was introduced on the LX3. So if you wanted this dynamic black and white kind of monochrome look, very moody, that's going to be one advantage here that you didn't get on the earlier versions of the LX cameras. That being said, one downside of the dynamic monochrome mode, even though it does a surprisingly good job in terms of contrast and even simulating some of the film grain if we zoom in, however, the resolution when you're shooting in this particular scene is limited to only around 3 megapixels. So if you're blowing this up into a larger display or billboards, do keep that in mind, compared to if you're shooting in intelligent auto in full color, it can capture up to 10.1 megapixels. And so even though it's really cool to have a film simulation black and white mode built into the camera by default, if you do want higher resolution, then perhaps capturing it in color and then converting it into black and white in post might be another option to consider if you want to preserve more detail when cropping in. Thankfully, this is also one of the improvements in the subsequent revisions of the camera LX5 and LX7, further increase the resolution of the files captured in the black and white film simulation modes. But here, even on a simple shot here right on the table, you can tell that the sensor, sharp lens, as well as impressive aperture is actually creating more depth of field or bokeh even on this smaller screen than you would normally expect. You can get very close to objects, everything looks very sharp, including even this image of the table, as you can tell here, is focusing on the wood grain, and then naturally the background is getting separated, creating that depth of field or bokeh effect that we usually see on larger sensor cameras. Alternatively, here's a couple of examples of shooting using the 16:9 aspect ratio mode on the very top, getting you some more pleasing looking landscape shots just by using that directly built into the top of the camera. So definitely is quite fun to play around with. As far as some additional menu options are concerned, you can also use it as kind of a digital photo frame. There are some limited editing capabilities like resizing the images directly on the camera itself. Tapping on the display key here can also pull up additional contextual information, including whether the flash was activated as well as the histogram view. Also, when you're reviewing photos, tapping on the focus key here zooms in 4 times, allowing you to see in a little bit more closely to the center of your image, as well as using the zoom rocker here to further zoom in and out. Again, the camera is capable of displaying a live histogram view as well. That being said, of course, one slight downside of an older camera that is approaching 2 decades old is you also have to keep in mind that some of the original battery cells have probably also degraded and lost some of their life. But thankfully, spare batteries are very easy to pick up on Amazon and eBay, often for just around $8 or so. So thankfully, that is a part that's quite easy to replace, despite it being an older model. Let's now transition into a couple of sample shots that I took with the LX3 and see how the performance is like. Alright, so the takeaway is the overall photo quality is extremely impressive for such a small point-and-shoot Digicam, especially considering its age. It really does have a very sharp and impressive lens, as well as offering colors that are almost dreamlike in some instances. And all the examples that you guys saw actually were straight out of the camera JPEGs, even though this thing is capable of shooting in RAW, like I said, allowing it to retain more details if you want to recover things like highlights just by editing it in software like Photoshop later on. However, if you just want a more casual point-and-shoot experience without the fuss of editing, even those results honestly looked really good in my opinion. Aside from the pleasing colors, I also enjoyed the super macro mode. Now, one thing to keep in mind though is aside from the autofocus maybe being a little bit slower, you have to be slightly more patient, you also do have to hold still when you're capturing macro because it is so close to an object. Even though it does have optical image stabilization, which is helping, but when you are blowing things up so much by looking at those tiny little details, for the sharpest results, you still have to hold still. And also keep in mind that if you're using the xenon flash, it might be overly bright for really close-up shots. So some natural lighting around you will also improve the performance of those macro images. But in general, it was quite impressive when it locked in. You guys saw how the fibers of the paper were even magnified, almost like a microscope. It is consistently surprising in a good way when it comes to the general performance. So it does hold up, and I think this is the reason why it has been such a critically acclaimed Digicam of its time. So there we have it. That's more or less been a revisited, kind of retro throwback look at the Panasonic Lumix LX3, and by extension, also a very quick reference point side by side here with the LX2, which offers, again, a pretty similar resolution as well as sensor size. So many of the points that we mentioned in this video are kind of copy and paste when it comes to the LX2 as well as LX1 here, although if you guys think that the autofocus and operation speed were a little sluggish on the LX3, then the original 1 and 2 are going to be even a bit slower than those by comparison, since they are even older cameras. For example, even previewing back some of the photos, because they are around 10 megapixels for 2005, you can see how it just takes a couple of seconds even for the images to load back, compared to on the LX3, it was significantly faster when looking back at your results. Not to mention an inferior display when it comes to resolution as well as viewing angles as well, so not quite as pleasing there. However, again, the design of the original one in terms of the body dimensions and the simplicity of the grip here on the front, I do think is a lesson in minimalism, and I personally do really like the aesthetics of this camera. Even though functionally speaking, I have to say that the LX3 and LX5 is probably where things really started to take off. The usability improved dramatically, as well as became more versatile as well. So anyways, again, this is an excellent series of Digicams, I would say, to consider if you are thinking about experimenting with the physicality of a actual camera, giving you, again, mechanical keys, a comfortable grip that you can hold on to for hours and hours of shooting, versus on a smartphone, everything being a lot slimmer, having to use a touchscreen probably isn't as fun, quote unquote, to shoot with. And I also think that something like this is still going to get you much better results thanks to the optics as well as components inside, excellent build quality for its day, versus some of the modern interpretations like the Cam Snap that are surprisingly actually not too far off in terms of price point. So I would actually recommend something like this instead of something like this if you're okay with shopping around for a used model, since of course being a decade-old camera, it's going to be very tough to find a brand new in-box revision at this point. But anyways, the photo quality definitely still holds up and remains actually quite impressive and fun to play with to this day. The results really speak for themselves. So that has been the critically acclaimed Panasonic Lumix LX series, the LX3 revisited. Thanks for watching this retro throwback here at OS Reviews.